Hello, my name is Harris Macagno. This is my semester project for Crim 127. Alright, here we go. So the first case that I looked at was Siegel v. Fitzgerald. So this is United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. The judge was John G. Roberts. I attended online through audio. I listened to it, and it was a pretty good listen. I liked it a lot. So this courtroom, I noticed, seemed very normal. There wasn't a lot of, I don't know, you say like interesting, to me at least, things that happened. It seemed very, like, standard, I would have to say, from a couple of the other ones that I watched. It seemed very normal. The cases that it dealt with were with the federal government. The issue particularly to this case was if the 2017 Amendment, which was part of the Bankruptcy Judgeship Act, violates the uniformity requirement for the Constitution Bankruptcy Clause by increasing quarterly fees in certain districts under the U.S. trustee program, and not those under the Bankruptcy Administration Program. So they were showing kind of a discrepancy in the fees for some places in different districts and others. Like some would have an increased fee when others wouldn't. And so there was a lot of controversy there because they wanted to know why certain districts were being treated better, if you will, with the lower fees. So the courtroom ran very smoothly, I noticed. There wasn't any like major interruptions, like banter back and forth. There wasn't anything like that. It was very smooth, went off without a hitch. They seemed very respectful of each other's time and their speaking. Some key takeaways are that the 2017 Amendment to the Bankruptcy Judgeship Act, which imposed the fees, increased that the exemption debtors in two states, so there was two states that saw an increase, that it did violate the uniformity requirement of the Bankruptcy Clause. So Justice Sonia Sotomayor, I don't know if I butchered that, authored the unanimous opinion of the court. So in this case, the victim, if you would, was the states that saw a quarterly fee increase. They felt that they were being treated unfairly. So they were represented by a petitioner and given a pretty fair evaluation, I would say. I think they were represented very fairly. The victim, which was the two states, again, that saw the increase in fees, they had many rights granted them under the Bankruptcy Clause, which one of their major ones, the one that was evidently enough violated, was the right to be treated the same, essentially, to everybody else. So compared to the defendant, who had a lot of rights as well, they had even more rights under the 2017 Amendment in question. The other states were given better treatment than the two states that saw the quarterly increase. Due to the nature of the court case, I could not find any cases talked about in class that related. This case was very much about banking and bank law and things like that. So I had a really hard time looking through what we talked about in class to kind of compare it to. A lot of what we talked about had more specific ties to things such as like double jeopardy, search and seizure, lineups, a more, I guess, criminal aspect, whereas this case was very about like banking and that kind of side of things. So I didn't find any that we talked about that related to this case specifically. The next case that I looked at was Joyce Crawford versus Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity. So this took place in the Michigan Court of Appeals. The Attorney General Dana Nessel was the judge. So this courtroom to me stood out the most out of all of the court cases that I looked at. The judge seemed like she was genuinely concerned and interested about the topic at hand, and I'll get into a little more why later, but briefly right now, it had to do with her community, so there was obvious, interest there. So I attended this one via a YouTube video recording. In the cases she discussed, they were a lot of them were in regard to insurance fraud or claims that insurances were filing fraud when there was none, that kind of thing. A large majority of the issues revolved around due process being violated. They were being violated, supposedly being violated, because the fraud agencies would use a automated system that would ping or kind of pick up on anything that was suspicious or looked to be fraudulent. I did notice that the judges conducted themselves very differently than what I had seen prior. They were very generous with their time. They gave a lot of the speakers that spoke, the lawyers and the insurance experts and the people like that, they gave them a good portion of time to explain themselves, where I noticed with other judges, they were really like, oh yeah, you only get 10 minutes, and it was up to your department, if you will, to tell us this background information. Like their folders weren't fully briefed very well, things like that. But I noticed in this case, the judges that were there, they were very, very willing to work with the defendants and the prosecution. They were super, super generous in that sense. I did also notice that in this case, the lawyers it was funny, they would always, whatever the judge said, they would agree with and then pivot their statement around it. So this worked really well for the prosecution because they were kind of on the same page with the judges, but the defendant, which would be the insurance company, they didn't seem like it was working as well for them. So some key takeaways were that the Michigan Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity, they were using, like I said, an automated fraud detector. The issue at hand was if that violates due process. The reason why that would violate due process is because there is no investigation going on. There's no person that goes and reviews that. It's strictly automated by like a computer. The victim was represented by a local law firm, which I felt was important because that law firm has ties to the community, and so it is kind of in their interest, like the judges, to figure out what's going on, because if this agent or insurance agency has a lot of people, which it does, it's the Michigan Department, then anybody employed under them would be subject to a similar kind of issue. Now, one of the biggest rights that play a role in this case, like I stated, is due process. So one case that is similar to this one that I found that we talked about was Griswold v. Connecticut. It is connected because the issues in both were the same. They both were in defense of due process. They both wanted to make sure that the due process was being done correctly. Another case that we spoke about in class was Mapp v. Ohio. This case dealt with the violation of due process as well. Its focuses was more about the incriminating evidence that was gathered. Still, it connects to this case on account of due process being a factor. That because Mapp wasn't given due process, then the evidence that was collected shouldn't have been presented as evidence. Moving on to my third one, Jewell v. NSA. This one took place at the United States Court of Appeals, Ninth Circuit. The judge stood out because of his very strict way of running the courtroom. He was very on top of it. He very much made everybody kind of follow exactly how he wanted things done. There was a few instances where the lawyers would, I guess their mannerism he didn't like, so he would tell them, hey, like, could you change the way you said that, or could you explain that better than you did? Stuff like that. Like the things that the lawyers were doing weren't up to his expectations was like the vibe I was getting. So I attended this one via recorded video. This case dealt with the victim's rights. It also had aspects of search and seizure. The judge, like I said, seemed very particular, corrected the prosecution and defendant multiple times. Some key takeaways are that each judge is different. They like to run the courtroom how they like, and unauthorized obtaining of private information used for the sole purpose of surveillance is not illegal. Another thing to note is in this case, there was a big factor of intent that played into it. So this case was about Jewell, who worked at, I believe, AT&T, found out that her information was being collected by the NSA and reviewed and also like used for surveillance, and that to her was a violation of her privacy, and there was no reason for that to be happening, so she tried to sue to get that undone. So the victim was represented as a normal person. She sought to keep her private information private. The victim's rights that played the biggest role was her Fourth Amendment right. The defendant used past acts such as the Patriot Act to try to defend their stance, the NSA, try to defend their stance on why they needed to collect that information. But there was no clear connection to terrorism when talking about Jewell's private information. Comparing the two, it's clear that the defendants had more compelling rights. A lot of their defense was built upon the fact that the information gathered wasn't gathered for surveillance purposes exactly, or just for that. So one case talked about in class that compares to this one is Terry v. Ohio. This case dealt with Terry being frisked and arrested on a gun charge. He tried to say his Fourth Amendment right was violated, but it wasn't. It connects to Jewell because her information was taken for surveillance. So Jewell's information, private information, was taken without probable cause, that kind of thing. There was nothing that led up to it. Well, in Terry v. Ohio, Terry tried to say that the gun that he was found with that was on his person, that wasn't valid because of his Fourth Amendment right. So it kind of didn't work out for him, though. So another case we talked about in class was the California v. Greenwood. It relates due to Greenwood claiming the search of his garbage was unlawful. In his case, it was proven to be okay because he left the trash out in public view. Therefore, a third party, the trash service, the garbage man, could come pick it up. So now it was no longer, I guess, his private things. So it was okay for police to search through it and eventually get a warrant to search his house, which led to his arrest. The next case I looked at was Blockberger v. U.S. So this took place in the Supreme Court of the United States. This case, like a few of the earlier ones, was very uniform. I attended via online transcripts. This case dealt with the double jeopardy clause. I observed that the defendant was very much on the offensive. The prosecution had very compelling evidence. Blockberger tried to use the double jeopardy clause to get a lesser sentence. So some key takeaways are that in certain scenarios, double jeopardy is not absolute. So if someone does an act but breaks two separate laws, they can be charged for each individually. So Blockberger was represented sort of unfairly because I would say because he was essentially charged for the same thing twice, but it had two specific different law names, therefore they were able to prosecute him twice. So the decision to charge him for multiple counts of the same crime did, like I said, seem unfair. The prosecution tore apart his double jeopardy defense because of that. So one case that relates to this one is Ash v. Swenson. Ash was prosecuted and found not guilty. He was later tried again and convicted. The connection is that this case displayed the exact use of double jeopardy. Ash was tried twice for armed robbery, found not guilty, then guilty, which you can't do. The second case that was similar to Blockberger was Gamble v. United States. This case dealt with the issue of double jeopardy as well. Gamble, however, introduced a new aspect. He was tried at both the state and federal level for the same crime. So he tried to say that he was tried for the same crime twice, which, yes, that's true, he was. But because the state and federal are two different bodies, the judges deemed it okay to be prosecuted twice because they were their own entities. The next case I looked at was Ashcraft v. Tennessee. This one took place at the United States Supreme Court. This courtroom was very lively due to the nature of what was being discussed. I attended via online recorded reading of the transcripts. This case ties into the Fifth Amendment. Ashcraft was forced to give a confession and saw a lot of backtrack being done by the state. They tried to establish that Ashcraft made the confessions on his own. Some key takeaways are that the circumstances under a confession are really important. They have to be non-coerced. They can't be forced. They can't be tricked, that kind of thing. Basic stuff. The central issue was how the confession was obtained legal. The charges against Ashcraft were as follows. He was charged with hiring a hitman to kill his wife. The victim was represented very unfairly. The evidence that the state used against him was all things that they forced on him. They made him confess. I think it was a 38-hour-long interrogation with no breaks until finally he broke and confessed to something he didn't do. So the victim's Fifth Amendment right played a huge part in this case. Compared to the prosecution, he had a solid case based on the violation of his Fifth Amendment right. A case that parallels this one is Brady v. United States. Issue was if Brady chose to plead guilty to avoid the death sentence. It relates because Ashcraft was coerced into his confession. Another case that connects is Spano v. New York. It was about Spano being interrogated for hours and police using a childhood friend to coerce a confession. Like Ashcraft, Spano was not given a break after countless hours of questioning. Also, the use of his childhood friend, who was a cop, to, I guess, lower his guard was super, super, super wrong. They couldn't and shouldn't have done that. And that looks like that's my presentation. Thank you guys for tuning in.